projects that get.
Yeah, well, right, and I certainly agree with you, and I didn't mean to imply that money is not a factor. Clearly, I think it's both. This is a clear case of both ends, but I think the money piece, in a way, is kind of obvious to most of us, whereas the ideological piece, I think, is less obvious. And so we were interested trying to understand the ideological piece, and I've been asked that question a lot. Do I think the ideology is authentic, or do I think it's just used as an excuse as a cover-up for greed? And I think the answer is both. I think there are certainly people for whom it's about money, but they use ideology as a cover because the ideology is virtuous, right? The ideology is an ideology of personal liberty, and that's something that virtually all of us agree with. So if I say, I'm a greedy SOB and I'm just doing this for billions of dollars, none of us are going to think that's very attractive. But if I say, I believe in personal liberty and I don't want the government telling me how to live my life, that's something that a lot of us do think is attractive. So it's certainly the case that you can use ideology to cloak greed, and I think that certainly happens in this case, and in the cases you invoke as well. Although in my area, actually, we don't have that rule. My lawn was overgrown for years, but now there's no lawn because we've gone xeriscape. But I don't think it's just that, because as I said, we were trying to understand, why would Bill Nierenberg do this? I mean, as far as I know, Bill Nierenberg had no particular relation to the fossil fuel industry, you know, and he was well paid as director of Scripps, and he had a good life. And so I think there are a lot, and also, again, why millions of Americans have sort of accepted the climate skepticism arguments. And opinion polls show, like, nearly half of all Americans, I mean, it goes up and down, but nearly half of all Americans do think the science is unsettled, you know, we don't really know, and that a large-scale big government intervention to solve the problem would be a bad thing, right? Often the rhetoric is linked to this issue of big government, and lots of Americans are skeptical of big government, and you know, maybe rightly so, right? That's something that we could at least have a conversation about, because there are some arguments to be had about the role of government and where the, you know, what is the right, where do you draw that line between where government intervention is appropriate and where it's not, and how do you make those decisions in a democracy, right? Those are all legitimate arguments. So I think there are millions of Americans, and I've met some of them in my talks, who are legitimately influenced by these arguments, the ideological arguments, even though they do not have any personal vested stake in the fossil fuel industry. And I think that's really important to understand, because if this were just about, you know, the fossil fuel industry owning senators, which they clearly do, but if it were only that, I think it would be easier to combat, because, you know, one of the interesting things that I got asked a lot when I first started lecturing about this was, given how powerful the tobacco industry was, how did we ever manage to get tobacco control? Because after all, the tobacco industry owned senators. I mean, there were senators that were referred to as, you know, the senator from Winston-Salem and the senator from Philip Morris, right? I mean, it was kind of an open secret that the tobacco industry owned senators. But yet we did get tobacco control. And so part of that had to do with, well, it's complicated. There were a lot of different factors that went into developing tobacco control. But I think that, you know, understanding the way in which people have tried to make this argument attractive is a really important issue. And again, you know, because of lack of time, I'm always like putting in and taking out different pieces, because depending upon what's going on in the world, certain things seem more or less important. So, you know, I have some other material I didn't cover here, but about the whole network of think tanks that are now involved in this. And, you know, because it starts with just the Marshall Institute, but now there's this network of think tanks that include, there are about 20 different think tanks across the United States today that foster climate change denial in one way or another. And Bob Ward at the Royal Society did a really useful study of this, and I really need to work his data into my talk. So at one point, ExxonMobil was funding 35 different organizations in the United States that promoted climate change denial in some form or another. And many of them, well, some of them were sort of obviously promoting fossil fuel use, right? And obviously ExxonMobil's interest is fairly obvious. But a huge number of these were promoting free market capitalism, libertarian viewpoints, anti-regulatory. And then you get into this whole thing, well, is that authentic, or is that just a front for ExxonMobil? And I think the answer is, you know, it's all of the above. There are many people affiliated with the Cato Institute who are authentically persuaded that, you know, what von Hayek said, that in general, government regulation is something to be avoided, and the issue is whether or not the costs are justified, right? And that's not an irrational argument. That's an argument to then say, okay, how do we judge the costs, right? But then there are other people who use that as a front to do the bidding of the fossil fuel industry. And so that becomes very hard to unpack. And that's why I think it's just important for us to acknowledge that it's both and, not either or.